He flew home with pearls in his pocket and left with his heart broken. The car eased up the narrow street like an offering, headlights touching the cracked stucco of the house that had once been full of laughter. Maurício held the small velvet box between his fingers, its weight both trivial and heavy. A tourist gift, a promise of attention, a bridge between two lives that ought to have been easy to join again. He expected the kettle on the stove, the soft clatter of plates, the smell of cinnamon. He expected Maria at the doorway with flour on her hands and a grin that had survived every bad season. Instead, the house answered with silence. The front door was not locked. That was the first wrongness. The halogen light over the small kitchen sink blinked and hummed. The sound was insistent in the quiet, the refrigerator's weak murmur like something breathing at the end of its life. He stepped in, calling, "Mom?" as if the sound could summon the familiar way she shaped his name. The kitchen was smaller than he remembered and emptier. A plate sat in the sink with a smear of something long dried on it, a fork placed across like a detained thought. He opened the refrigerator out of habit. The light inside showed a single jar of jam and a lone lemon. The emptiness felt obscene. A wave of nausea came not from hunger but from the violation of expectation, that the house would care for the woman who had once stuffed his pockets with coins and stitched her shirts. He stood for a long moment looking at a vegetable drawer filled only with air. A voice came from the next yard, tight and hurried. "Maurício, you're here." She was a neighbor he'd known his whole life, Lucia, her hand still on a gate. She wore a shawl and an alarmed face. "He's here," she called more to herself than to him. "I don't know how to say it." Maurício moved toward her before he could think better. Her eyes darted past him to the faded house and then to the lane where a small, stooped figure sat on a plastic stool near the stoop of another house. Maria. She sat with an empty plate balanced on her knees, fingers curled around its rim as if it were a fragile telephone. Her gray hair had escaped the pin that used to make it dignified. A scarf, too thin for the season, curled around a neck that had carried him through fevered nights and scraped knees. Her shoulders trembled slightly when she laughed, the hollow sound of someone apologizing for asking too much. Seeing his mother there, begging for scraps, a sight he had never imagined, hit him like a physical blow. He had been in boardrooms and lounges where people measured sorrow in spreadsheets. He had delivered keynote speeches about growth and stability. None of it prepared him for the immediate, rotted sorrow in her eyes. They were not vacant, they were ashamed. Shame sat on her face like a second skin. "Ma!" He crossed the yard in 2 strides and crouched before her as if she were still small enough to be held. He reached out. She flinched, and then softened at the familiarity of his voice. The plate trembled in her hands. "Please," she said very softly, to the woman at whose door she had knelt. Just a little, for tea." Her words were not a complaint. They were an apology for being present. Neighbors' faces gathered at windows and gates like a chorus, whispering so the words would not bruise the air. Maurício looked from face to face, matching them to the years of his childhood, each of them a small evidence that the neighborhood remembered who his mother had been before she wrapped herself in silence. He did not remember ever seeing Maria ask for anything from another neighbor. She who had sewn, who had given away her own shoes before she bought his, now sat with an empty plate in her lap and the light catching small tears on her lashes. He felt the earned armor of success crack. He felt stupid. He felt terror. He felt a closeness to all the poor things in the city that the textbooks never taught him about. "Why didn't you call me?" he asked before he could stop himself. The question sounded accusatory and cracked. He was not sure if he blamed her for not calling or himself for being away. Guilt arrived like a late guest at a funeral. She looked at him and for the first time unspooled the long, slow thread of shame she had been keeping knotted. "I tried," she said. "Your wife, she changed the phone bills. She said it would be easier this way." Mauricio's hand curled around the velvet box in his pocket until the edges bit the skin. He had assumed Viviane, his wife, perfectly tanned and aloof in their social photos, would welcome his return. He had assumed she would set a table. Everything he assumed now felt like a lie. The neighbors began to tell their small, collected stories like witnesses passing along a flame. Nusa, their former housekeeper who still worked in the older blocks, stepped forward last. She had been with Maria for years. Her face bore the pragmatic kindness of people who have learned to be useful in sorrow. She hesitated, then said, "She's been here before. 2 weeks now, asking." Her voice held the kind of justice that forms among people who see each other enough to know when something is wrong. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked Nusa, but his voice was softer this time. He felt fragile around the edges, as if the house itself might crumble. "I could have—" "You were abroad," Nusa said plainly. "You trusted." She trusted too much. Trust. The word landed like a stone. He thought of the transfers he'd set up. Small, regular payments into his mother's account, for groceries, for medicine. He had automated care the way he had automated emails. Set it up and assume it ran. On paper, he was present. Monthly entries showing debits. Numbers that meant he had taken care of things. But the living arrangement of love was not numbers. It demanded presence. And he had given his energies elsewhere. They went inside together.
Maria moved slowly, as if the air was prickled. Her kitchen smelled faintly of cloves, a scent that summoned him back to a childhood winter when she'd put cinnamon on every cake. In the drawer, he found a small spiral notebook, its pages worn and flapping at the edges. The handwriting inside was small and slanted, like a bird's foot. At the top of the first page, "For when you come home." Maurício felt a strange need to protect those pages. He opened it as if reading might be a sacrament. The first entries were recipes, then small recollections of days, when he fell, when he cried, when she said not to worry. Then later entries bled into a different language, complaints about bills that had not arrived, notes on phone calls that got disconnected, names, Viviane, Carla, written in heavier ink. There were messages on his own phone, hundreds trapped like fish in a net. "Ma? Call me. Where are you?" The oldest unread texts were months old. He had dozens, but his phone had been on an auto-forward, a detail he had trusted Viviane to handle. A setting changed, numbers blocked. The screen showed a neat column of silences where his mother's voice should have been. At the bottom of one page in the spiral, in handwriting more tremulous than the rest, a line, "I am sorry. I do not know how else." The page was folded, creased, as if someone had tried to hide their shame in the paper. He sat on the kitchen floor with the notebook in his hands and felt the ground move under him. The pearls in his pocket felt worthless, a costume for a man who had lost the only place he ever truly belonged. He could feel rage rising, the fine, hot sense of blood drawn into the periphery. He cut it off, like someone slamming a heavy door. He would need clarity. He would need facts. "Bruno should see this," he said at last, because Bruno would know how to turn scraps into a spine. Bank statements, transfers, little betrayals that pile up into a crime. Bruno came over that evening, briefcase in hand, his face the kind of pragmatic that makes accountants unnervingly comforting. He arrived with the soft gravity of someone who knew the world in ledgers and could read motives in numbers. They spread papers across the kitchen table like voiceless witnesses, bank printouts, transaction dates, the cold, precise language of transfers from an account labeled in Mauricio's name to various recipients that, as Bruno pointed out, did not include a single grocery store. "Look here," Bruno said, tapping a line with his pen. "These transfers are diverted." He traced them with the point like a conductor revealing a theme. The money Maurício had designated for his mother's care had been redirected. Small sums at first, $200, $300, and then larger withdrawals that matched paydays. They were greased through names that looked like aliases, consultancies, accounts with coastal addresses. The pattern was not an accident. It read like a hand that had learned to touch the ledger without leaving fingerprints. He felt a sensation of being unmade, piece by piece, by arithmetic and deception. "You don't need to think the worst of yourself," Bruno said gently, anticipating the confession that Maurício felt would erupt from him. "You built a life. You put your trust in the person you married. People exploit trust. That's not a reflection on you." But Mauricio's stomach twisted. The idea of Viviane wearing a designer coat and smiling at their philanthropic evenings, twisting the benefit checks meant for his mother into petty indulgences, felt obscene. He replayed last month's small irks, a canceled plane ticket he'd assumed a glitch, a dinner that had been attended without him. The details began to settle into a map. They found other things, a telephone bill with a line marked roaming that never should have been there, a roster of unpaid utilities that did not correspond with the automatic withdrawals Maurício believed were maintained, the way items had been logged, misnamed, white-labeled.
Bruno worked through it with patient forensic curiosity, clicking and cross-referencing. He called in favors, made quiet international inquiries, and his face would occasionally harden at pages he glanced at. "You need to freeze some accounts," he said, "for now." Freezing an account felt like a late consolation. It did not bring back the mornings his mother stood at a neighbor's door, plate in hand. It did not offend the taste of shame that sat on her like an unwelcome shawl. But it was a move forward, a shove against the invisible machinery that had been siphoning away what belonged to his mother. When Maurício finally confronted Vivienne that night, the house held the overheated silence of a room before a confession. Vivienne stood in the doorway to the master suite, dressed as if she'd come from a meeting. Her smile was slow, like a person practicing warmth. She placed 2 fingers on the edge of a glass, then said, "You're back earlier than I expected." "Why did you block Mom's calls?" he asked. His voice was a blade wrapped in velvet. He had rehearsed the sentence so many times, but his anger was now a bland thing. He needed answers, not theatrical satisfaction. Vivienne's face shifted, then smoothed. "Block? I didn't block anything. You know how phones are. Sometimes they stop working." Her eyes flitted to the box in his pocket, as if she wanted to see what the pearls represented and how much of an accusation they were. "I took care of the bills. That's what I do while you're away." "You took care of the bills by making sure my mother had nothing," he said. The words surprised him with their coldness. He had never used that tone with her before. He had never let himself accuse in full before. "Why?" Vivienne's shoulders tightened. For a moment the mask slipped, and a sharp, insecure light flashed in her eyes, something that looked like fear. "It isn't as simple as you make it," she said. "We were making decisions. For the house, for the business. You don't see all of it from your flights and conferences." Her answer made the world shift under his feet in a different direction. Not simple malice, but calculation shaded by anxiety. She had the posture of someone who felt boxed into choices. "We were making decisions." Those words could be read as a justification. She said it with the weary cadence of someone who had convinced herself of a necessity. He pressed, "Did you take money from her account?" She inhaled. "There were transfers. I used some for the boutique." The admission came out like an attempt to honesty. "Carla needed seed money. It was an arrangement. We were going to pay it back." Carla. The name scraped like a fingernail on a chalkboard. Vivienne's sister had always been a shadow at their brunches, a woman with a soft laugh and a fondness for silk scarves. She owned a small boutique now, one of those spaces polished with curated taste, an Instagram-ready place where people sipped coffee and tried on skirts. If the boutique was a glittering object at the end of a deception, it felt obscene. If the boutique was a dead ode, it mattered. There was a human face there, not a villainous boogeyman. "You forged signatures?" Maurício asked bluntly, because the ledger suggested more than loans and transfers. Some lines looked as if they'd been traced over by a hand not quite practiced in mimicry. Vivienne's jaw tightened. "I signed what needed signing. It was for security, for the mortgage." Her voice went thin with a certain kind of honesty that people use when they want their actions to be seen as necessary. "I did what had to be done to protect the house." "You protected the house by taking money from my mother and handing it to your sister's shop?" His voice rose despite his attempt at control. He saw the mansion of his assumptions crumble, a glossy life propped on small cruelties. "And also," she added with an air of defiance, "we were struggling. We needed capital. You were not present." She said it as if absence were a crime she had the right to punish by redistribution. The words lodged in him. He wanted to strike. He wanted to dismantle her defenses in the light. He wanted to be louder than his fear that he had been a man who let his family suffer because he was too busy being successful. He left the conversation before it could become a scene. He needed evidence. He needed allies. He needed to find a trajectory not just for his outrage, but for restitution. Needing allies, he thought of Nuce and Bruno in the neighborhood who had known his mother longer than his marriage. They had begun to speak already. The threads that would become a net were starting to collect at his feet. Maurício took to the house rooms the way a man picks paths he does not know well, cautiously, with a map in his head that had missing pages.
He found more papers tucked behind picture frames. He found a set of official-looking documents with a serried row of signatures, one of them bearing a hand that looked suspiciously forged. It was a transfer of property, a deed recorded with a clerk's stamp. The house his mother had lived in for 40 years, the place where he had learned to read, where she had taught him to hold a sugar cube for a friend, had a paper that suggested she was no longer its owner. He felt a wild, precise thing in his chest, the sense that his life had been rearranged by someone who had thought the rearrangement would never be noticed. When he showed Bruno, the accountant made a small sound between his teeth. "This is old school," Bruno said. "This is the kind of forgery that takes time, but it's detectable. See the pressure here? Different ink. There's a notary stamp that doesn't match the dates." He ran his fingers along the page like a reader following Braille. This could mean someone attempted to take legal ownership. "If this is true," Maurício began, but the sentence curved into 100 other possibilities. The legal machine could be slow and unwieldy. The neighborhood's justice could be faster but messy. The cameras of social media could be a hammer. The law could be a scalpel. He was afraid of both. They started to gather proof. Nusa produced a list of dates when bills had not been paid, when a gardener's call had gone unanswered, and when medicine had been late. She told of small nights when Maria had wandered the block asking for soup, of the way Viviana had eventually dismissed her concerns as trivial. The neighbors corroborated. Lucia had video on her phone from a night they'd found Maria at her gate, twisting a coin between her fingers. The footage was small and careful. One clip of an elderly woman, head bowed, under a street light. In the video, her voice rose in a whisper. "Please, just some tea." It was not sensational, but it was devastating. They printed everything and placed it on the table like a court of things. Each item was quiet, but when they were together, the ledger lines, the spiraling notebook, the messages, something like a shape emerged. It was a pattern of extraction, of people who converted affection into agency. It was also, he realized, a test of his own priorities. Had his absence allowed this? Yes. Had his trust been misplaced? Also yes. But that did not reduce the cruelty of what had been done to his mother. At the edge of the kitchen, Maria watched the pages like someone reading a foreign language. She brushed her fingers against the printouts as if the paper might somehow soothe. She did not flinch when the word forgery moved in the air. She had learned through years of patience to bear the weight of bad news with a strange kind of gentleness that made everyone in the room want to do better. At some point, she reached for Mauricio's hand. "You have always returned," she said. "You have returned now."
He could see the pain behind her attempt at consolation. It was not a placation. It was a moral imperative born of the same hands that had wiped tears from his face when he scraped his knee. "I should have come sooner," he whispered, and the apology came raw. He should have known, he thought. He could have imagined if he'd allowed himself the thought. But the details are cunning thieves. Small withdrawals, missed calls, a blocked number, a sister in need. They are discreet. They are plausible. They are the sort of thing that hides in plain sight under the armor of normal life. The more he thought, the more he recognized the cultural comfort with negotiating the edges of family finances as if affection could be fungible. The next days unfolded like a slow operation. Maurício canceled accounts, moved funds he could control, and began the long, meticulous process of reconstructing a paper trail. He called his bank, put holds where he could. He made lists of transfers and began mapping them to receipts and invoices, clothing store inventories, boutique rent payments, small luxury purchases that should not have been connected to senior care. He hired a lawyer's first hour, a formal and sober person who used words like evidence preservation and chain of custody. The lawyer would be careful, a necessity both legally and narratively. News moves differently than paper. It breathes. It needs a face and an ear. Maurício and Bruno began to collect the small things that make an accusation plausible outside a quiet kitchen. Filmed statements from neighbors, the spiral notebook with Maria's handwriting, the bank statements. They did not want to create spectacle. They wanted to make sure that when they stepped into light, they could not be dismissed as hysterics. They needed proof. A micro hook kept pulling him forward like a tide. The deed. If the deed were indeed falsified, the theft was not limited to the flow of money. It was an attempt to take shelter itself from the woman who had earned it with decades of life. He could not imagine the idea of contesting that legal document, of walking into an office stacked with paper and mechanized indifference and saying, "My mother did not sign this." At night, the house felt different. He slept poorly in the room that once sheltered only him. He had become a man with two kinds of bravery, the one required to fight in court
and the one required to sit and listen while his mother told him about the days she had chosen to be quiet. He watched Maria in a way that peeled away assumptions. She was not passive. She had a dignity that made even the neighbors soften. She would sit on the stoop and hum a hymn she rarely spoke aloud in the church, and sometimes she would touch the back of his hand and say, "It will be all right." He wanted to believe her. He also knew that justice would not arrive because prayers alone were uttered.
Between the papers and the neighbor testimonies, something else began to thread through. Not only greed, but fear in Vivian's voice when cornered. A thin human reason for what she did. "We were trying to protect the house," she had said. It sounded like an explanation and a plea. It did not make the theft tolerable, but it complicated the picture. Antagonists are seldom born fully formed as monsters. They are adults making fearful calculations, and in that lie the tragedy. The more evidence accumulated, the more public the story threatened to become. Lucia, who had the habit of worrying aloud, suggested at one point, "We need people to know." The idea landed like a fruit that refuses to remain on the tree. The neighborhood's anger was a slow-growing thing, and it had the dangerous virtue of righteousness. Maurício felt it wrap around him, support that could protect his mother, and also, if mishandled, turn into spectacle that would make their pain into entertainment. He thought of the pearls again that night. They seemed absurd in his pocket. He had meant to place them in his mother's hands as something small, a personal ceremony of return. Now their meaning had been transformed. They were trivial against the larger expectation of care he had missed. A single careful CTA moved like a soft current through the end of one evening. Stay with us to see what he uncovers. He did not want to turn pain into a rumor, but truth needed witnesses. The idea of people beyond their block holding watch felt like an added layer of safety. With Bruno poring over dates and Nusa collecting witness statements, they followed the first bright thread, an account registered in a nearby coastal town. It received regular payments that matched the entries in Maria's ledger. The account was associated with a company that at first glance sold nothing more scandalous than bespoke retail goods. But when Bruno dug deeper, the company's registry listed Vivian's sister, Carla, as a director. The boutique, Carla's boutique, had been opened the year after the first odd withdrawal. When Maurício confronted Carla, it was in the neutral fluorescent lights of a shopping center. She wore a smile like a practiced thing, and her hands fluttered with trim gestures, as if the drama were an accessory to be arranged at her convenience. She put on the same casual defensiveness Vivian had used. "We took a loan," she said. "Vivian helped us with initial capital." The words came out as if the generosity justified every method. Maurício held a printed bank line across the table like an accusation. "This money is from my mother," he said plainly. "She didn't agree to this." Carla's face shifted in a way that suggested nervousness rather than guilt. "You don't understand how small businesses begin," she said. "Capital is hard to come by. We thought we were doing the right thing." The language of reasonable enterprise mixed with entitlement to the confusion. Her eyes flitted to the store's displays as if they were evidence of a belief in a life reimagined through silk and receipts. It was hard to see malice there, and easier to see rationalization. That made it more dangerous. A video of the exchange ended up online, an unplanned thing filmed by someone in the food court. It showed Maurício holding documents and asking questions. It showed Carla speaking with unsteady confidence. It showed Vivienne's phone vibrating on the table, then being picked up. The clip was short, nothing like cinematic exposition, but it had enough to stir a reaction. It spread in a slow burn at first, then flared. The neighbors texted clips to one another, and a local reporter named Amanda reached out for comment. Maurício did not want spectacle. He wanted accountability. But he also knew that once cameras were involved, the velocity of the story would change. It would no longer live only in the quiet suffering of a single street. It would be about communal responsibility. He made a choice he felt conflicted about. They would not hide. They needed witnesses. If the law was a slow furnace, public attention could be a quick ember. He hoped it would be used to warm, not to consume. In the days that followed that mall scene, the online murmurs coalesced into something louder. Friends in his business circles called, offering legal contacts and expressions of disbelief. Some were helpful, others were awkward, their sympathies enclosed in social distance. The law took its first steps: questions, emails, a formal request for records. The banker asked for identification and signed forms. The motion of the system began, always politely, always bureaucratically. It would be careful. It would be deliberate. Maurício sat with the ledger and the spiral notebook and the video, feeling the weight of the choices he had to make. He paced back and forth in the small yard at night, the stars indifferent above, and thought about the meaning of presence. Money could be replaced. Time could not. There was a private shame in recognizing how many times he had chosen to be somewhere else. It took more than a check to make up for the time he had missed. Maria, when she spoke, framed things in a way that astounded him. "I forgive," she said one evening, not as an absolution, but as a strategy. Not for them, for me. So I am not held by a thing that happened. Her voice had the kind of clarity that belongs to people who have lived long enough to understand the difference between justice and trauma. She wanted restitution. She wanted the money restored, the house safe, the law to take its course. But she did not want her soul to be imprisoned by hate. I admire her for that, and the admiration was laced with something like envy. The strength to forgive without letting go of justice was not easy. It required a careful moral architecture he felt he had not yet learned. At the end of the week, Bruno brought news that made the kitchen feel suddenly too small. Offshore transfers. Small amounts had moved through intermediary accounts, softening into a sum that could be relocated. The pattern was deliberate. Someone had understood how to obscure a trail. "We can trace it," Bruno said. "It will take time, but we can." The sentence was both promise and warning. Time, again, was a factor. The longer these sums moved, the more complex it would be to reclaim them. Maurício sat at the table and pressed his forehead to the paper as if contact might birth something like a prayer. He wanted to dismantle the machinery that had been used to siphon his mother's money. He wanted to confront Vivienne and Carla and watch them understand the devastation of what they had done. But he also breathed the softer needs of the house: to return the kettle to the stove, to bake the chocolate cake his mother loved, to rebuild trust in a life that had grown brittle. This was not only about money. It was about presence and the rituals of care. Money could buy medicines. It could not buy the warmth of a hand in yours when the world shook. He had to become a different kind of man, one who knew he could not outsource tenderness to his pockets. Before the weekend closed in, a man in a plain suit arrived with a certified letter. The envelope was thick, the seal official. Maurício opened it with a hand that trembled in the way adrenaline trembles, meant to be steady, but not quite. The letter contained a notation from a clerk that a deed had been recorded under a different name in a registry on the other side of town. The signature did not match the one in the kitchen stack. The language of the letter was technical and neutral, but Maurício read malice into every comma. He looked at Maria. She had aged in a way he had never seen before, years like small incrustations placed on a face. She smiled at him, soft, a little ashamed. "You did not need pearls," she said, remembering perhaps the velvet box in his pocket. "I needed you." He wanted to take the pearls from his pocket and give them to her anyway. He wanted them to mean something. Instead, he put the velvet box on the table among the capers. The contrast felt obscene and honest at once, a thing meant for adornment placed beside the hard, ugly facts of a life betrayed. The first part of the struggle, the discovery, was over. Or perhaps it was only the first chapter of it. They had proof, they had neighbors, they had a narrative that could be told. But they also had the threat of legal complexities, of offshore labyrinths, of people who would attempt to argue that the man who had been absent deserved to be judged for his absence. They had the knowledge that Vivienne's motives were tangled with fear, and that Carla's small shop was both creation and consequence. Maurício sat at the kitchen table, the weight of responsibility settling into his shoulders like a garment he could not remove. The city breathed around them, indifferent and vulnerable. He had the choice to let the lawyers steer everything, to keep things hidden and procedural, or to bring this story into the light, to make other people uncomfortable enough to hold the system to account. He could see already that restitution would not be merely fiscal. It would be moral and public and personal. Outside, a child laughed as a scooter rattled by. Inside, Maurício looked at the spiral notebook and read Maria's small lines about recipes, about the night he failed to find the words to speak at his father's funeral, about the time she had taken him to the market and let him choose the biggest orange. The small memories pressed him in the chest. He called Viviani that night. She answered, tense. "You need to talk to Carla," she said almost immediately. "We were trying to protect you. We thought—" Her words softened and frayed. The conversation ended without conclusion. The next day, Maurício would go to the bank with Bruno. He would begin to take legal steps. Nusa would bring a pile of receipts she'd kept secret for years. The neighborhood would start to talk louder. The thread of money would begin to be tugged at both ends. If the first moment had been a blow, the next stages promised a long, precise unraveling. He felt both ready and not. He had returned home with pearls and left with a new covenant: to be present, to make amends, to make sure that no one could again convert his mother's life into a line item. The revelation that had broken him was not the sight of his mother kneeling with a plate. It was the slow realization that the life he had built could be hollowed by the people closest to him. He looked at Maria as she sat by the window, the afternoon light making a halo of dust around her. She raised her hand in a small, practiced gesture and patted the air near him, like a benediction that asked for nothing and offered everything. He held his breath, feeling the future form itself like a map drawn in a fog. The next steps would require more than anger. They would need courage, patience, and the community's steady insistence that wrongs be made right. And there, surrounded by proof and grief and the soft, insistent neighborhood, Maurício began to plan not only how to reclaim what had been taken, but how to remake what had been broken. He looked at Maria as she sat by the window, the afternoon light making a halo of dust around her. She raised her hand in a small, practiced gesture and patted the air near him, like a benediction that asked for nothing and offered everything. He held his breath, feeling the future form itself like a map drawn in a fog. The next steps would require more than anger. They would need courage, patience, and the community's steady insistence that wrongs be made right. And there, surrounded by proof and grief and the soft, insistent neighborhood, Maurício began to plan not only how to reclaim what had been taken, but how to remake what had been broken. He looked at Maria as she sat by the window, the afternoon light making a halo of dust around her. She raised her hand in a small, practiced gesture and patted the air near him, like a benediction that asked for nothing and offered everything. He held his breath, feeling the future form itself like a map drawn in a fog. The next steps would require more than anger. They would need courage, patience, and the community's steady insistence that wrongs be made right. And there, surrounded by proof and grief and the soft, insistent neighborhood, Maurício began to plan not only how to reclaim what had been taken, but how to remake what had been broken. Bruno set up meetings, called in favors at the bank, and drew lines between dates and amounts until the pattern looked less like suggestion and more like a plan. He worked late into the evenings, eyes red from spreadsheets, voice hoarse from explaining to people who did not want to know why a small-town elder's account mattered. Nosa collected receipts and little scraps of evidence, an envelope opened and taped back together, a canceled check, a grocery loyalty card that showed purchases inconsistent with what had been withdrawn. The first formal step was to file a police report. It felt at once small and enormous. They went together, Maurício, Maria, Bruno, and Nosa, into the municipal precinct, where a clerk listened, took the statements, and then assigned an officer to the case. The policeman was a middle-aged man with gentle manners who had seen more neighbor disputes than white-collar embezzlement. He took Maurice's statement like a sacred thing. "We'll review the documents," he promised. "It may take time." Time again, the word that felt like both friend and enemy. The lawyer's office smelled of coffee and paper. The lawyer, Ruth, was precise, with short hair and a no-nonsense tone that made Maurício feel steadier. She outlined options: civil suit for restitution, criminal complaint for fraud, and immediate steps to preserve assets. She stressed, more than once, that legal processes were subject to proofs, to time, and to the intricacies of international banking. "We do not promise outcomes," she said. "We promise process." Her honesty was a kind of gift. They filed motions to freeze any accounts that could be tied to the transfers. The bank responded by placing holds on some cards and asking for court orders for others. It was a procedural dance that consumed documents and patience. Bruno worked nights to craft clear timelines, dates of transfers, matching invoices, the boutique's registration, the alleged notary stamps. He forwarded emails, set up cloud folders, and labeled everything in a way he thought a judge would appreciate, orderly and telling.
The forgery of the deed became their sharpest worry. If it held, Maurício could lose the only home she had known. Bruno and Ruth arranged for a forensic document examiner to analyze signatures and stamps. The examiner's laboratory smelled of ink and chemicals. Under magnification, the differences were clear. Pressure lines that did not match, ink that sat differently on the paper, a stamp that had a slightly different embossing than the registry's official imprint. The report was careful and technical. It left space for legal argument, but created a strong basis for contesting the deed's validity. When he saw the examiner's graphs and magnified strokes, Maurício felt his anger change shape. It was no longer a hot, immediate flare. It was a methodical heat meant to dismantle a machine. The tiny strokes of the pen had been used like a chisel. Now the chisel would be scrutinized.
Word of their filings began to travel in quiet ways. Amanda, the reporter who had reached out after the mall clip, requested an interview with Maria. Maurício debated the choice for a long time. He feared spectacle, the reduction of pain into a headline. But he also knew that public attention had a function. "I will speak," she said. "If my voice can give someone else courage to tell the truth, I will speak." Amanda arrived at the modest house with a small crew that moved like shadowless visitors, efficient and respectful. They sat on mismatched chairs in the living room, a camera angled to capture Maria's face without turning it into a trophy. When asked about her experience, Maria spoke slowly, her voice steady. She did not go looking for drama. She told the facts, of missed calls, of transferred money, of mornings she had been too ashamed to wake her son. She spoke of forgiveness too, but not as an escape. "I want my home back," she told the camera. "I want the things that were taken returned. I want to be looked after the way a mother should be." The clip Amanda produced was short and spare. It did not sensationalize the pictures of an older woman at night. It stayed with Maria's face and her hands as she folded the spiral notebook closed. The video spread slowly at first, shared by neighbors and then by friends who knew Maurício from his professional life. People clicked because the story had the taste of a basic injustice that felt familiar, a parent neglected while life went on. As the story reached more people, something else began to move, people's instinct to help. Donations came in to cover immediate needs, a stack of grocery gift cards, a check to pay for overdue utilities. A local pastor organized volunteer visits to help around the house. The attention brought lawyers who offered pro bono hours and activists who knew how to navigate bureaucratic back channels. The mayor's office took notice after Amanda's segment ran on the local news, and a liaison was assigned to help navigate municipal resources. But with attention came scrutiny. Viviane and Carla felt public pressure like a narrowing room. They began to receive calls from people in their social circles who asked questions with a polite cruelty. Viviane's messages shifted from defensive to pleading. In private, she texted Maurício more often, messages that vacillated between apology and assertion. "I thought I was doing what was necessary," one message read. "We were drowning and I pulled air into our mouths. I didn't know how to fix it without breaking everything." Maurício read the text with a fatigue that felt almost devotional. He had to decide how much leniency a betrayal could expect. He thought of Maria's hands, of the plate balanced on her knees, of the small notebook where she had written, "I am sorry." He thought, too, of the way Vivian had said, "We were trying to protect the house." None of these thoughts made the brokenness vanish. Negotiations started in the sterile rooms of lawyers. Vivian offered a plan, staggered repayments, a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and an agreement to let a trustee oversee funds allocated to Maria's care. Carla, increasingly aware of the legal exposure, proposed closing the boutique and returning inventory and funds. But the offers were half steps without legal teeth. Maurício and Ruth pressed for binding agreements and immediate deposits. The community pushed too. Neighbors gathered signatures on petitions for restitution. They staged a small, dignified presence outside the boutique one morning. No shouting, only the act of being seen. They held signs that read things like, "Respect our elders," and "Justice for Maria." The look on Carla's face when she saw the petitioners through the window spoke more than any legal brief. She had not expected the human response she now faced. The boutique lost customers that week, as people debated whether to patronize a store that had benefited from alleged theft. Public pressure worked in ways that formal letters could not. The boutique's landlord received calls asking about the origins of the capital used for rent. A small creditor demanded proof of payment. These ripples created friction. Carla reached out to Vivian, and Vivian, who had been in a defensive crouch, seemed suddenly small and unmoored. For all of this movement, Bruno continued to chase offshore leads, a digital detective in an ocean of nominations and shell accounts. He spoke with foreign banking contacts, filled out mutual legal assistance requests, and tracked small sums that had been routed through intermediaries. "We can see the footsteps," he told Maurício, "but following them across borders takes time and legal cooperation. It's not impossible, but it's slow." Bruno's candor kept expectations realistic, which was vital. They could not promise an immediate reclamation of every dollar, but they could and did reclaim enough to make a difference. A frozen tranche of funds, small but meaningful, was returned after a bank compliance review. It arrived as a transfer labeled simply restitution. It didn't fix everything, but it paid for overdue utilities and topped up a modest emergency fund for Maria. The moment the transfer landed, Maria made tea and served cake, the chocolate cake she'd always made with care. The smell of cocoa filled the house and felt like a small, sacred repair. Not everything, however, could be rectified by banking entries. The deed remained contested. The registry was a bureaucratic cathedral where change was not easy. Ruth's motion to annul the transfer required witnesses, sworn statements, and the forensic report. They scheduled a preliminary hearing.
The judge would look for intent, for the process by which the deed had been recorded, and for whether Maria's signature had been legitimated. It was the kind of slow, careful process that could take months. During the waiting, Vivian made a move that surprised many. She offered a public statement acknowledging mismanagement and asking for forgiveness. It was a fragile thing, an apology that tasted of both regret and self-preservation. Some neighbors rejected it outright. Others accepted the apology as a necessary step in a larger restitution. Maria listened to the recording of Vivian's statement with a steady face. Then, in the kitchen with Maurício and Bruno, she spoke. "I heard her," she said. She folded and refolded a corner of the spiral notebook. "It is not my place to say what the law should do. She must answer to the law. But when someone says, 'I'm sorry,' I can accept it into my hands and fold it away. I will not be imprisoned by anger." Her words were a kind of moral architecture. Forgiveness would not preclude legal action. Maria wanted both accountability and freedom from the corrosive weight of hate. Maurício learned to admire that clarity and to model it. He knew, too, that public forgiveness could complicate a legal case. Prosecutors sometimes view public remorse as a factor when considering charges. He let Ruth handle those conversations, and Ruth navigated them with the professional neutrality of someone who understood the difference between social healing and evidentiary needs. A critical turning point came from a place neither highly technical nor terribly dramatic. A handwriting sample that matched the forged signature was discovered in an unlikely folder at the boutique. Nusa, in her meticulous way, had noticed an old form, an application for a small grant, that had the same suspicious loops as the deed. She handed the paper to Bruno, who felt his chest tighten when he saw the similarity. Ruth used that discovery to support the motion to annul the deed. It was not conclusive by itself, but added to the mountain of evidence, it became a slope, hard decline for the defense. Under mounting pressure, from the bank, from the community, and from the threat of formal proceedings, Carla agreed to a mediated settlement that included returning a portion of funds and dissolving certain accounts. It was not a full restoration. Some sums had already been spent, concealed, or moved, but the boutique's assets were evaluated and allocated to a restitution fund. Carla's gesture was handled not as a theatrical renunciation, but as a legal move. Payments were structured, an escrow was arranged, and the terms were placed under a judge's oversight. Vivian's case was more complex. She was offered a path that combined civil settlement and a referral to counseling and financial oversight. The lawyers proposed a binding restitution schedule tied to income and a court-appointed fiduciary to monitor the funds meant for Maria's care.
Vivian resisted at first, as anyone would when forced into accountability. But under the weight of mounting evidence and public scrutiny, she signed an agreement that, while not erasing her actions, created a mechanism for making amends. She would also agree to return what remained usable, including some personal items bought with diverted funds, and to cooperate with the formal audit. The public, watching, had mixed feelings. Some called for prison, others asked compassion for someone who had acted from fear. The media spun narratives in both directions. Amanda took care to present the story as layered, not as a moral circus. She interviewed neighbors, legal experts, and Maria herself. The segments focused on the human costs of elder financial abuse and on practical steps communities could take to prevent similar harms. As the legal processes continued in their slow, stubborn way, the community's energy turned toward construction rather than only confrontation. At a neighborhood meeting held in the small church hall, people spoke about prevention, how to look out for elders, how to check that automatic payments are actually reaching their intended recipients, and how to create local networks of care. Maurício found himself listening to voices he'd not given much attention to before: an older woman who ran a knitting circle, a recently retired contractor who offered his skills for free, a young social worker who wanted to start a registry of elders with trusted contacts. The idea of a support center, once a vague notion in Maria's mind, took shape into a practical dream.
a place where elders could go for assistance with bills, legal advice, companionship, and small medical checks. They called it, at first mildly and then with more courage, the Maria House, an elder support center with a name that held the story of one woman and the potential of many. Funding came from multiple small sources: local donations, a modest municipal grant nudged by the mayor's office after Amanda's coverage, and volunteer hours from professionals who wanted to give back. Maurício promised to seed a fund from his own resources too, not to buy absolution, but to be present in a different currency: time and stewardship. Designing the center became a communal project. Neighbors painted, a carpenter fixed the wobbly counters, and a group of cooks designed simple menus for a weekly communal meal. Maria insisted that the kitchen keep a special place for the chocolate cake she had always baked. For birthdays and for when someone has needed a little sweetness, she said. The smell of chocolate became a motif. It threaded memory into the present. There were hard conversations too. Vivienne, in the months following the settlement, attempted to make amends in private ways, volunteering at some community meals, attending a restitution workshop, and offering to meet with Maria. These gestures were awkward and uneven.
Maria accepted Vivienne's visits in a measured way. They sat, they talked, and Maria listened. She did not allow old wounds to be dismissed as nostalgia for the past. She asked questions, and she named harms. Vivienne sometimes wept. Sometimes she rationalized. It was humanizing, but not excusing. Maria set limits. One afternoon, with winter thinning and the center nearing readiness, Vivienne came to the house with a small wrapped box. "For the cake," she mumbled. "I thought—" Her voice trailed. She did not ask for forgiveness out loud. She was not entitled to it. But the box contained a small set of measuring spoons, humble, practical, the sort of thing one would use to bake a cake. Maria unfolded the paper slowly. She looked up at Vivienne and, in a voice that surprised everyone with its steadiness, said, "You will need these if you ever plan to make cake the way I taught you." In the months that followed, they worked to set the center's foundation legally. The group formed a nonprofit, drew bylaws, and applied for a small municipal grant to cover a coordinator's salary. The mayor attended one of the planning meetings and offered to connect them with social services. Amanda covered each step with restraint, focusing on the ways a neighborhood can organize to protect its elders rather than turning the story into spectacle. The deed was finally brought to a preliminary hearing. Ruth presented the forensic report, the bank records, and the witness statements. The registry's clerk testified that the notary stamp did not align with their records. The hearing did not deliver a final resolution. Judicial wheels grind slowly, but the judge issued a provisional injunction recognizing enough irregularities to temporarily block the contested property transfer. It was not a declaration of final ownership, but it removed the immediate threat of Maria being turned out of her home. When the judge read the order, the courtroom felt both lighter and still poised on a hinge. A decisive legal victory would take time. Nonetheless, the injunction felt like a shelter, a temporary but necessary reprieve. Outside the courthouse, a small group of neighbors had gathered. There were no parade banners, only a quiet cluster of people with warm scarves and determined faces. They hugged and then headed home to continue the work of the center. The ribbon-cutting day arrived with the sort of ordinary fanfare that so often makes public transitions meaningful: a modest banner, a table with pamphlets about elder rights, and a small plate of Maria's chocolate cake cooling under a cloth. The mayor cut the ribbon and praised the community's initiative. Amanda recorded Maria speaking about the purpose of the center: help, dignity, and oversight. Tears were present, they were not theatrical. The center's first clients were neighbors who needed simple help with bills, young adults who wanted to learn about wills and powers of attorney, and a few elders who came just to sit and talk over tea.
Maurício stood to the side and watched the people he had once seen as background become the texture of possible repair. He had spent money on lawyers and on a small renovation. He had spent less time at conferences. He volunteered to run a monthly workshop on financial literacy, not to teach elders how to invest, but to teach them rights and red flags. He became accountable in a way he had not expected, showing up, returning calls, sitting in rooms where hands were wrinkled and laughter sometimes bloomed like a stubborn flower. The story spread beyond the city. Other communities reached out, asking for guidance and creating similar centers. Amanda's careful reporting had turned the specific into a lesson. The narrative shifted from one family's tragedy to a communal template for protection. People, strangers in other towns, wrote notes thanking Maria for her courage. Small donors offered funds earmarked for outreach. Legally, the process continued. The criminal complaint remained under investigation as authorities reviewed evidence and determined whether charges were appropriate. Ruth cautioned everyone not to assume that the legal system would move quickly or decisively. It might, and it might not. That real uncertainty hung in the air.
Yet some restitution was already in place. Payments from Carla's dissolved accounts had been transferred into the restitution escrow, and Vivian's interest in pre-committed installments had been recorded under court terms. The bank had adjusted its practices too, offering a senior care liaison to help set up watch protocols on elder accounts. There were personal reckonings that no law could address. Maurício moaned to sit through Maria's slow, patient recollections of childhood breakfasts and the smell of sugar on her fingers. He learned that presence was not always heroic pages. Sometimes presence simply meant being in the kitchen while someone else finished a sentence. He stopped accepting calls with a humming impatience. He let days pass while he returned to the house and listened. He baked the chocolate cake with Maria, watching his hands correct flour measurements like a teacher. The batter's smell filled the kitchen and felt like a small rite of reconnection. The more the center became an actual place, a room for meetings, a small library of resources, a kitchenette for shared meals, the more the story's sting softened into a broader lesson. The neighbors who had once watched through curtains now asked to volunteer. Nusa taught a modest class on identifying financial abuse indicators, missed doctor's appointments, signed for packages that elders did not recall, sudden changes in power of attorney documents. Bruno gave simple talks about creating safeguards in online banking. The group set up a hotline staffed by volunteers who would check in on elders who wanted a friendly voice and verify their accounts when they asked for help. There were still hard moments.
One afternoon, Vivian appeared at the center without notice. She had a folder in her hand and a way of standing that spoke of someone who had rehearsed humility. Maria was present, along with the center's coordinator and a few volunteers. Vivian asked if she could speak. She did, haltingly, and with a voice that at times broke. "I am sorry," she said. "I wanted to fix it before anyone knew. I thought I was protecting a life that was fragile and would break if I told you what I'd done. That was selfish. I was afraid. I am asking for a chance to make it right." Silence followed. Not the silence of judgment, but of consideration. Maria looked at her slowly. She had the kind of patient vision that can see through someone's fear to the person within. "You hurt people," she said. "You used what was entrusted to you. The law will decide much of the rest. But if you want to work, you can help here. We need people who will commit to transparency. We need someone who will learn to turn shame into service. You can begin there." Vivian's expression changed at that couple of sentences. It was a small, human transaction, accountability paired with an offered path to repair. Vivian nodded and over the next months participated in a few supervised volunteer shifts. It did not erase her actions. It did not buy forgiveness. It was simply a beginning, messy and tentative, the only kind that real repairs tend to have. As the center grew, so did the practical impact. The first year, they helped dozens of elders set up checklists for automatic payments, connected families to pro bono attorneys, and established a neighborhood noticing network that checked on anyone who was isolated. They partnered with the mayor's office to train municipal workers to recognize elder financial abuse. They documented cases and created a simple pamphlet on how to secure a power of attorney, how to spot forged documents, and how to act when something felt wrong. Maurício found himself speaking at a small conference about his experience. He did not present himself as a hero. He used his story as a warning. Presence matters as much as provision. Months passed. Some nights he still woke with the memory of his mother kneeling on a step, the plastic stool scraping against pavement, her plate tremulous in her lap. The image was not something he could forget. It was the hinge on which his life had turned. But the memory no longer felt only like an accusation. It had become the reason he devoted his attention to the center, to being present in a way his old life had not allowed. There were quieter victories, too. A woman named Helena, who had been one of the first beneficiaries of the center's help, came back months later to say that with support she had contested a suspicious loan and gotten it reversed. An older man, Mr. Alvarez, who had always been proud and private, began attending weekly lunches and slowly told his story of loneliness and of a nephew who had taken advantage of trust. He left the center with a folder of documents Bruno's team had helped him secure. Those small, tangible outcomes made the larger, unresolved legal matters bearable. When the judge finally issued a clearer order about the deed, annulling the transfer on the basis of irregularities and the demonstrated evidence of forgery, the relief in the house felt like a release of breath. It was not a final verdict in every sense. There could be appeals and postures, but the legal system had, in that moment, protected Maria's right to remain in her home. It was enough to light a quiet celebration, cake, tea, and the slow unwinding of months of fear. At a small gathering that evening, with string lights hung in the yard and a circle of neighbors sharing stories, Maurício watched Maria cut a slice of cake and hand it to him. He took it,
and tasted the chocolate and felt something like restoration, cool and steady in his chest. He did not expect absolution. He expected and found a new way to live. The city began to notice the center's model as effective and replicable. The mayor spoke publicly of supporting similar initiatives across other neighborhoods. Amanda's follow-up pieces highlighted not just the wrongdoing, but the ways a community had come together to protect its most vulnerable. The narrative had shifted from scandal to solution, from an individual's failure to a community's capacity to respond. Years later, the center bore the name Maria House on its modest sign. It had expanded into a small network with satellite projects, phone lines, an educational website, and partnerships with local banks that had set up elder protection accounts. The number of people helped was small in the scale of a nation, but vast in the terms of lives touched. The smell of cake was no longer only a motif, but a real, ongoing ritual. Once a month, volunteers baked and invited clients to share stories. The ritual of cake became a kind of testimony to the possibility of sweetness after sorrow. Vivienne and Carla's lives moved on too. Carla's boutique was sold. She returned some of the funds and, in time, worked to rebuild a reputation through small business education. Vivienne, who had gone through counseling and maintained her restitution payments, continued to struggle with the consequences of her choices. She was not forgiven overnight. She was not exonerated, but she remained engaged in a way that acknowledged responsibility. The law walked its slow path. Some parts closed, some parts remained open. The community's job was not to mete out punishment, but to insist upon repair and to create structures to prevent harm. Maurício changed in small daily ways. He stopped rushing through visits and learned to be patient with quiet moments. He went through photos with Maria, old pictures of a little boy on her lap, eyes full of mischief and trust, and he began to write letters to his past self that he never sent.
He also kept working, but differently, not to fill an absence with ledger entries, but to align resources and time together. He sat in public meetings, lobbied banks for elder-friendly account features, and spent many Saturday mornings teaching basic financial literacy classes. In those rooms, he felt the strange comfort of being useful. On a late spring morning, a small cake sat on the kitchen table, a chocolate cake with a simple glaze, the recipe they had both learned to perfect together. Maria stood at the counter with an apron dusted in flour. Maurício, flour on his sleeves, measured the cocoa with a steady hand. The act itself felt like liturgy. They moved together through the steps like a duet, trading tips and small complaints and memories that tasted like sugar. When the cake was finally out of the oven, steaming and fragrant, they sat down to eat in the quiet way of two people who had survived a season that taught them the cost of absence. Maria pressed her hand to the back of his, the same gesture she'd used months before by the window. "You returned," she said, not as a triumphant note, but as a settled fact. He listened and felt the truth of it. He had returned, not only geographically, but morally. He had rebuilt presence into his life, and he had helped to translate that presence into systems of care that would outlast them. The center carried the name of the woman who had taught him to hold a sugar cube for a friend. It would grow beyond their street, beyond their city, into a modest network that would keep looking after elders. On the table in the center of the kitchen, the cake waited like a small, ordinary blessing. They sliced it into pieces and handed them to the neighbors who had become family in new ways. The community's laughter and easy talk filled the room, not erasing the pain that had brought them together, but softening it. Maurício saw people he had once only known in passing now become friends who called when he was away and visited when he was present. Presence, he realized, had a contagious quality. It spread through small acts and stayed. At the end of the day, as the sun slid and the yard cooled, Maurício stood in the doorway and watched Maria put a cup of tea on the sill. He thought about justice, its slowness, its necessary caution, and its capacity to do right when the right tools were applied. He thought about forgiveness as a courageous act that does not erase the past but frees the present to do justice. He thought about community and how it can choose to act as witness and protection when systems fail. The revelation that had broken him, seeing his mother beg for food, and the trail of small betrayals that explained how it happened, had indeed broken him. But from that break, something like a bridge had been built. It was not the bridge he had imagined when he returned with pearls in his pocket. It was a sturdier bridge, made of neighbors' signatures, of legal filings, of returned funds, of a center that would serve as both protection and education. It was a bridge built by imperfect people deciding to repair what had been wronged. That night, Maria asked him to sit and tell her about his travels, about the things he had seen. He spoke slowly, pausing to listen as much as to speak. When he finished, she took his hand and smiled the way a person who has weathered many winters smiles in spring, quiet, thankful, and steady. "Next month," she said, "we'll invite the children to the center. They will need to know how to watch for us, and we will need them." He nodded. He knew there would be more work ahead, more hearings, more calls from people asking for help. But for the first time in many months, the future looked like a place they could meet together, with the small, bright steadiness of cake and tea and people who stayed. Outside, the street breathed the ordinary breath of life. A dog barked, a bus sighed, a child's bicycle creaked. Inside, there was cake cooling on a plate, the smell of chocolate a promise that small things could hold great meaning. Maurício closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility that had become a choice he embraced. He had come home with pearls and found instead a problem he could not ignore. He had been broken open, and out of that rupture, a work of repair had begun, rooted not in spectacle, but in steady, persistent presence. Some things were still unresolved. Legal processes would continue, restitution would take time, and not everyone would agree with every choice made. But the center would stand, a small, stubborn anchor in a city that often moved too fast. And whenever Maria sliced the chocolate cake, people would gather and remember that dignity is not a thing purchased, but a thing kept, by watching, by showing up, and by refusing to let the vulnerable be invisible. In the quiet that followed the small celebration, Maurício sat with his mother on the stoop and watched the evening gather. He felt less like a man in a hurry, and more like someone learning to live slowly and responsibly. The revelation that had broken him had become the seed of something larger, a community that would not let another elder kneel in shame in the night. He promised himself, silently and fiercely, that he would keep showing up. And then, because it felt necessary and healing, he rose and helped Maria to the kitchen, where they would, as they always did, make another piece of cake and another memory, one that would be about presence and about how the smallest acts of care can become the architecture of justice.